I'm Charles Pence. I am indeed the new faculty member here in philosophy of the life sciences. I'm really excited to be here. I work in a number of different areas, but what I'm going to subject you to this afternoon is a bit of the kind of work that I do in the history of biology. So when I got the invitation to come talk in this seminar, the question of animal ethics is a really interesting one, and it immediately made me think of the work of Darwin. Darwin, obviously a crucial figure in our understanding of our place in the biological world. So my goal for today, what I'm going to do is move the cursor out of the text. What I'm going to do is give you some of the context for Darwin's work on the mind, on the emotions, and what little he says about ethics in the animals, which I think is very provocative. In particular, I want to talk through what he says about habits and mental capacities. So for Darwin, habits are the way that mental capacities begin to be built. And so there's a very strong connection for him there. Then I want to talk about the continuity between human and animal, both mental capacities and expressions of the emotions. And I'll close by introducing Darwin's ruminations as they are, Darwin's thoughts. They're a bit sketchy. Darwin is no philosopher. I'll say more about this later, but his thoughts on ethical theory and what they might have to say about the human-animal relationship. And the reason that I think that remains an interesting topic, even though Darwin's own thoughts on the matter are a little bit sketchy, is that I think when he does, as I say here, support a sort of evolutionarily grounded moral sense theory, even though he's not very sophisticated when he does this, I think the kind of theory that he supports is a really interesting jumping off point, because it gives us a way to think not just about continuities in habits, in mind, in emotions with the animals, but also continuity in a sort of broader moral sense. Continuity in living in a broader ethical community that I think, if we sort of take Darwin's premises in a consistent manner, would include both the humans and non-human animals. So that's going to be what we're going to do. A little bit of context. Let's talk about the background and how Darwin got thinking about this. I'm practically obligated. This slide winds up in like 3/4 of the talks that I give. I don't even know. It just sort of has this penchant for appearing. Because you've got to, I mean, everybody knows. And this is lovely colorized photograph. It's really very nice. So Darwin is now primarily known, right, for the origin of species. This is the work of Darwin's that we read the most. It's the one that I still assign to many of my courses. But to see why it is that he winds up talking about ethics, which in fact is something that he didn't really want to do. It's not an area that he wanted to wind up discussing. It's important to look some at the timing. The sort of history and scope of Darwin's career. So, in the early 1830s, it's his famous voyage around the world on the HMS Beagle. As it's often said that he's the ship's naturalist, but this really isn't right. What he is the gentleman companion of the ship's captain. The last captain of the voyage around the world had shot himself. And it was thought by the Royal Navy that maybe if we send someone wealthy that he'll be able to talk to, the new captain won't go crazy. It worked. They made it all the way around the world successfully. The mission of the trip was to surveil the south part of South America, to draw really good naval charts, to draw maps. So Darwin spent a lot of time on overland while the ship was doing that, because I guess if you were, I can imagine if you were Darwin, drawing up coastal maps would have been dreadfully boring. So Darwin's overland, it includes his famous trip to the Galapagos. Already by 1838, so immediately upon his return, he's thinking about evolution, and he's opening private notebooks that are including his thoughts about the origin of and change over time of species. And so this happens very quickly. For a reason that I won't get into, although I'd be happy to talk about this later if any of you are interested. There's been a lot of ink spilled over why it took him 20 years to decide to get to writing The Origin. Can back that up a little bit. By 1855, he's writing a draft of the book that he wants to write. I'll actually say more about that later because it is related to his thoughts about the evolution of mind and ethics. But it takes him a very long time to sort of come back to this idea. But in 1859, November the 24th, 1859, which is easy for me to remember because it's my birthday, On the Origin of Species is published and is quite makes quite a splash. The reason, so he was planning on writing, the reason that there was this other draft in 1855, he was planning on writing this absolutely encyclopedic, massive, probably 3-volume, several thousand-page work with encyclopedic references, all of his citations, every example that he could possibly think of. And then he gets, famously, this letter from Wallace, which Darwin describes as he couldn't have written a better abstract for my book, even if he had had my book. And so he rushes The Origin into print. And this means that there's a bunch of things that he wanted to be in The Origin that don't show up at all. And you might expect that his discussions of human evolution would be among them. So, of course, he completely avoids the issue in The Origin. This is the only thing he says about people. These 3 sentences. In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. This is what you write if you don't want to talk about something, right? This is how you don't talk about human evolution. Of course, everybody sees it and freaks out anyway. He really, though, by the time we get back to the late 1860s and the early 1870s, he's got ideas about human evolution. He realizes this is something that he can't avoid. And in particular, I think the driving force behind him coming back to these ideas is exactly the topic that we're going to talk about today. I think it's his thoughts about the ways in which we should place human mental capacities with respect to animal mental capacities. I think it's really one of the primary drivers. And so he winds up publishing 1 year apart from one another. He was writing them at the same time. The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex and the Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. So by and large, he's got 2 goals in these 2 volumes. The first thing he wants to do is he wants to establish a very extensive continuity thesis, right? He really wants to say, with respect to both physical and mental traits, and the emotions as well as a subset of mental traits, there are only differences in degree between humans and animals. We fit squarely within the animal kingdom, and there's no reason to think that there's anything particularly exceptional or special about us, with some exceptions that I'll come back to. It's not as though he doesn't think there are any character traits that are only held by humans. Of course there are. But we are no more different from the rest of the animals than the rest of the animals are different from one another. There's a number of reasons that he's interested in doing this on the surface level, right? This is a really good objection to evolution. I mean, what would be one of the first things you would think of if you were worried about whether or not Darwin could be right? You would say, oh, well, but wait, humans can reason. Animals can't reason. Reason must have to be specially created. How could reason possibly evolve? There seems to be this vast chasm between what we can do and what they can do. That's clearly Darwin's main focus. That's clearly the primary argument that he wants to make. But he's also, I think, got ethical claims in mind. I think he's also keeping in mind this broader worry about the moral sense, about the moral sentiment. And in the process, that's what really draws him to talk about the human-animal relationship, and that's what the rest of the talk will be about. So first let's talk about mental capacities. So of course, Darwin's critics are going to say that mental powers are going to be one of the primary things that has to mark out humans as completely special and entirely different from the other animals. And so he says here, if no organic being, excepting man, had possessed any mental power, or if his powers had been of a wholly different nature from the lower animals, he's speaking for his critics here, right? Then we should never have been able to convince ourselves that our high faculties have been gradually developed. But it can be clearly shown that there is no fundamental difference of this kind, right? This simply doesn't happen. These arguments by his opponents, he says, simply don't work. And to make the point, what he wants to do is canvass some really broad areas where you might find this difference in kind. Right? So here's a bunch of candidate differences for what might separate man from the animals mental capacity-wise. And my apologies, I'm reading so much Darwin right now that I'm just going to be saying man because it's how Darwin talks. I would rather say humans, but I start talking like Darwin after I read as much Darwin as I've been reading for the last month and a half. So the kinds of differences in kind that you might point to, and that people in fact did attempt to provide as arguments against Darwin's theory. So you might look at progress, right? So okay, humans can make progress. Animals don't seem to be able to make progress. Darwin thinks he has lots of examples for why this doesn't work. At the most basic level, he says, it's harder to trap old animals than it is to trap young animals. They figure this stuff out, right? What do you want? They get smarter as time goes on. But also he points to instances where it sort of looks like you get traditions that are passed on over time, that are passed on across generations. He thinks there's several examples of that, especially in primates. Humans use tools, animals don't. Darwin says that's of course not. We have plenty of evidence. We had plenty of evidence in Darwin's day. Now we have even more evidence. Now Darwin's favorite example is chimpanzees using rocks to bash open nuts. So this was very well known then. If we look through the primates, there are many examples, many more examples now. My favorite is they'll use sticks to fish termites out of termite mounds. And they'll pass on the knowledge of how to use the sticks and how to pick good sticks to their offspring. So like, okay, no, you gotta put it in here, angle it like that, and then you get all kinds of termites, right? That's a tool. That's clearly a tool. Humans use language. Now, of course, Darwin says yes. Obviously, articulate language is an exclusively human capacity. But he says, if you overemphasize that, you're going to be misled about, you're going to underestimate the two following things. First of all, there's a lot of very complex animal communication. Darwin loves to talk about bird song. Bird song is his favorite example here, right? And we know more than he did then. The bird songs have dialects. There are pop melodies that spread through the birds. Darwin, for his part, talks about, even in the 1870s, they already knew young birds are really bad at singing, and you can start to hear. So, like at first, they sing really off-kilter songs, and then they get taught, and they get better, and they start to get better in pieces. Like they rehearse parts of them more and more, and then eventually they figure out their song, right? And then they know how to sing it. They know how to sing it properly. The other thing that you'll underestimate, Darwin says, is you'll underestimate non-linguistic communication in humans. He says, look, we really importantly rely on non-linguistic communication of a wide variety of types all of the time. And so to say that language is somehow that important is also not necessarily true on the human side. Humans have a sense of beauty, animals don't. Oh no, look at mating displays. Right? Animals seem very clearly to have opinions about what they find beautiful and what they don't. And in lovely, crotchety 19th century colonial British style, he also adds, and look how terrible some humans' taste is anyway. Have you heard what some people call good music? This is actually basically a quote from them. He's like, people have music that they play that's just awful. right? So not even all humans have a sense of like real beauty. You know, get off my lawn, etc. So also humans have, now you can of course turn to the sort of more abstract, oh, wake up. You can turn to the more abstract, don't lock, wake up, just wake up fast. Quickly now. No, but lock. Sorry, I tried. You can look at the more abstract kinds of mental capacities, so self-consciousness, a sense of self, abstract thought or generalization, right? And of course, these are going to be exclusive to the humans. That Darwin is happy to agree with. But at the same time, there are plenty of humans that don't engage in such thought. And so if you take that as your bright line, Darwin argues, you're going to have overshot, right? You're going to rule out. He's enamored of, and to be honest, in the 21st century, I don't know the anthropological status of these claims, but he's enamored of these stories of cultures that can't count numbers past 3, right? Look, they don't have general thought. They're not abstracting, but they're people. And so we don't want to overshoot them in laying out the scope of our moral world. And so basically what he's trying to say is, wherever you try to stick this bright line, wherever you try to very cleanly separate man from the animals, you're either going to go too far, and you're going to remove some humans from the ethical community, or you're not going to go far enough. One of his favorite ways to talk about not going far, Darwin clearly really loved dogs. He was a huge dog guy. And so at one point in the Descent, he actually says, I'm sorry, if you can look at your experience with your own dogs and you don't think animals can reason, then I don't know what I'm going to tell you. Look at your dog. And that's the kind of sort of brute observational argument, right? Just look how happy he is to see you. That he makes over and over here, trying to say that you're just not going to be able to pin this line down in the right place. So emotions, Darwin considers his book on the emotions to be sort of one continuous project with the mental capacity work that he does in The Descent of Man. He'd intended to just release all of this as one giant book, but they got huge. In fact, The Descent of Man is already 2 volumes, so he went ahead and broke the thing up. He's not known for being concise. And he thinks that almost all work on human emotions has been wrong for one of the following 2 reasons. First, people haven't given enough credit to the emotional capacities of animals. And so there's this book by Charles Bell, a British author, who Darwin, in fact, reading this book, Darwin says, is one of the main reasons that he sort of became interested in this topic, that he realized it was important. And so Bell evidently wished to draw as broad a distinction as possible between man and the lower animals, and he consequently asserts that with the lower creatures, there is no expression but what may be referred, more or less plainly, to their acts of volition or necessary instincts. And he further maintains that their faces seem chiefly capable of expressing rage and fear. Right? So he's trying to give the sort of only the most basic possible emotional expressions to the animals. Again, he's going to refute this in a variety of ways, as we'll see here in a few minutes. In fact, Darwin has a massive list of emotional expressions that he thinks the animals are capable of. But for the moment, he just uses his favorite example. He says, man can't express love and humility by external signs so plainly as does a dog. When with drooping ears, hanging lips, fleshless body, and wagging tail, he meets his beloved master. He's like, look, you're not as good at being happy as dogs are, right? Dogs are way better at being happy than we are, which seems to me just clearly correct. If you're wondering about the quality of these arguments, I'm going to come back to that in a second. We'll be back. We'll be back to that. The other problem is belief in the inherent sort of special nature of human emotional displays. And hey, I don't have to translate this quote. Excellent. So Duchenne, famously, right, work on human emotion, but the smile he's now primarily known for, right? He was the first to sort of propose that there was a way, looking at human, the way that people smile, there's sort of, you can clearly tell an authentic smile, which is now often known as a Duchenne smile, from an inauthentic fake smile, which is what I do every time anybody tries to take my photograph. And so but what does he do that Darwin doesn't like? Well, how should we understand emotional displays? We should understand them just by pointing at the fact that, well, that God wanted to be sure that we would be able to communicate our emotions on our faces to each other, right? And so God went through and carefully crafted all of our facial muscles, whether one or more than one at once, right, to be able to sort of best express our emotional states to those around us. And of course, Darwin's going to have no use for this kind of an argument, right? This gives you no leverage for trying to understand what's going on in the biological world, for Darwin. And again, the deficiency in Darwin's account, and I'm backing up to the dissent here, but the deficiency in Darwin's account, about which I'll say more, is that while he is grounding all of these observations in either personal report or testimony of observers, in fact, he distributes a questionnaire about emotional expression in human tribes that haven't had much contact with Europeans. He's really interested in how much of human emotional expression is actually shared among all people. So he tries really hard to find people working in the middle of nowhere to see what people who haven't been able to learn how European folk express emotions, how do they express their emotions? Do they express their emotions in the same way, or are there distinct differences? Well, he tries to ground as much of his work as he can in that kind of observation. For him, the observations just sort of form clear and obvious arguments, right? So he has a very hard time actually arguing for these kinds of emotional displays. Here, right, the lower animals just manifestly feel pleasure and pain, happiness and misery, and rather than a sort of real argument, we get another observational example. Happiness is never better exhibited than by young animals, such as puppies, kittens, lambs, etc., playing together like our own children. Even insects play together, as has been described by that excellent observer Robert, who saw ants chasing and pretending to bite each other like so many puppies. Right? I really want to go find this paper now. It's footnoted. It's footnoted, the UCLouvain article. So I need to go look it up, but I didn't get a chance to. So he has a hard time offering anything like an argument, and it means that he gives you a ridiculously vast catalog, I'm not even going to read this, of emotional expressions that he thinks just obviously appear in the case of the animals. Some of them are sort of very fundamental, and in fact it seems pretty reasonable to say that animals can be fearful or angry in the same kind of ways that we can. Some of them, though, seem to require something like a theory of mind, right? So something like revenge or pride or shame seem to entail that not only do I know how I feel, but that I'm making inferences about what all of you are thinking, and I'm, ashamed precisely because my conception of myself differs from your conception of me, right? So that's pretty hefty, right? That's a large burden of proof to demonstrate that animals actually have. Some of them, wonder and curiosity seem to me almost to imply a sort of second order level of thought, right? That you're not just thinking directly about the world, but you're thinking as well sort of about the contents of your own desires, the contents of your own mental states. Again, completely without argument. This list is just offered with, in each case, manifold examples from nature, which he says just clearly demonstrate, right, that animals are behaving in this way. Magnanimity. Look, mother animals will adopt other orphan baby animals. That's magnanimity. isn't it? End of, argument over, right? So it's a strange approach. Of course, it's the approach of a non-philosopher. He offers a few illustrations. In particular, these drawn from the animals, although drawn from the simplest kinds of emotions. So a very small caption down here. This is dog approaching another dog with hostile intentions, in case you couldn't read that from the image. So right, ears forward, tail up, legs in an aggressive position, hackles up down the back. Right, we all know what an angry dog looks like. And then here's the same dog being happy. Right, ears back, submissive posture, tail down, etc., etc. The same in a humble and affectionate frame of mind. He's hired an artist to do these lithographs for him at some expense, which he informs us in the introduction to the book. On a slightly more theoretical level, however, one of the things that Darwin wants to do that I think is worth looking at is he wants to break down the sort of monolithic idea of reason into individuated processes of reasoning. Because it seems like those are the sorts of things that it's much easier to look for and find evidence for in the animals. And once you've done this, weird appeal to authority, but cool, few persons any longer dispute that animals possess some power of reasoning. Animals may constantly be seen to pause, deliberate, and then resolve. It is a significant fact that the more the habits of any particular animal are studied by a naturalist, the more he attributes to reason, and the less to unlearned instincts. And so partly here, you're also seeing an equivocation that's happening all over this literature in the 19th century, where you've got reason not just as the kind of process that we might talk about when talking about reason, but you've also got reason as not instinctive, right? Something you had to think about a little bit. It wasn't automatic, it wasn't pre-programmed, it was general purpose. Again, it's not that that's unrelated to our concept of reason, but it is something that's at least worth pointing out.
Question of clarification?
Yeah.
Does it distinguish reason and intelligence?
He doesn't talk about intelligence very often. It's not one of his favorite concepts. Every once in a while, he'll mention intelligence, but it's not clear to me. In the same way that I think I know what he's doing with the process of reason, it's not clear to me what he means by intelligence when he invokes it. And in particular, to what extent it either is or isn't contiguous with reason in that regard. That's not clear to me at all. Even though when fairly complex emotional displays, for example, are concerned, we're going to be able to tell evolutionary stories, again, back to the continuity thesis, or again with the continuity thesis, that connect those human displays to the animal kingdom. Right? So he says, the community of certain expressions in distinct though allied species is in the movements of the same facial muscles during laughter by man and various monkeys, is rendered somewhat more intelligible in Darwin's classic, he tries not to boast about his own theory, somewhat more intelligible if we believe in their descent from a common progenitor. Right? So we're going to be able to use evolution to help us understand what's going on in cases like this. And contra authors like Duchenne, Darwin says, there are no grounds as far as I can discover for believing that any human muscle has been developed or even modified exclusively for the sake of expression, right? All we've done is taken facial anatomy that's completely contiguous with our evolutionary ancestors and co-opted it in various kinds of interesting and complicated ways. We're not even, we haven't even undergone any kind of selection that would modify our expression, our expressional features, expressive features, for the sake of expression, Darwin says. I'm not going to go into it here because it is the matter of about half of the book of the expression of the emotions, but this is in fact the main thesis of that book. He spends about a chapter each in excruciating detail, describing which muscles of your face have to engage to produce all of the various emotional expressions. And he's got a wide variety of dissectional evidence, but he's also got very early experimental work connecting electric currents up to individual facial muscles to try to isolate their effects. This was obviously fairly new stuff. And so he's got a bunch of data to support this claim. This claim is very, very, very well grounded. He even illustrates and compares them with photographs. So Duchenne's work had been illustrated with very, very early heliotypes. He actually reprints some of those. Darwin goes out and gets some of his own photographs. Darwin's book is the first English language scientific work illustrated with photography. I think Duchenne's might be the first French language work illustrated with photography, scientific work illustrated with photography. There's something about emotional expression that makes people want to get really accurate photographs. I mostly drop this in here just because I think we're in a really interesting period in the history of science in the late 19th century. There's very interesting things going on with the notion of objectivity behind his invocation of these photographs. I think it's really cool. It's not my topic at all for today, but I just wanted it to be in there. So here's some photographic plates. This is the kind of thing that he's looking at. Duchenne famously, his most captivating and most famous instance, I don't believe it's the guy on the right, I think it's one of the later photographs, later sets of photographs, publishes this famous pair of photos, in one of which the guy is smiling authentically because he's actually happy, and in another which he's being told to fake smile. And I can show you those photos blind, and it's very likely that every single one of you would correctly guess which one the correct smile was and which one the fake smile was. And this is one of those very interesting cases where, so Duchenne and Darwin by extension is saying, so how are we so good at this, right? What is it that we're seeing, and how can we understand it? How can we understand it scientifically? And he also wants to give, so returning then to the evolutionary story here, right? He wants to give at least as best he can, a discussion of how these traits might have evolved and when. And this, I think, is important for sort of making this continuity thesis a little bit more subtle. Some of them clearly predate human evolution, right? Because we know that they've got analogs all over the animal kingdom. Laughter, especially. We have even better evidence for this now. Rats laugh in the ultrasonic, so you can't hear rats laugh, but if you tickle a rat, it laughs. Yeah, if you get the right kind of detection equipment. It's a very influential Finnish biologist, Finnish or Estonian? Estonian, thank you. Jaak Panksepp, who argued that was the first to tickle rats and record them appropriately. Not a bad job, right? We just get to make animals laugh for a living. Rage, fear, also clearly we respond when we get angry or scared in exactly the same way that all of the animals respond when they get angry or scared. And our sort of non-linguistic responses to trauma, distress, or grief, right? Screaming, grunting, all of that kind of thing. Again, shared with all of the lower animals. Some of them will be more recent. Weeping, he has this complicated theory about eye anatomy that I'm not really, I'm not an eye anatomy guy, so it's not doing anything for me. But many of these have to do with the evolution of bipedal motion, right? Obviously, any gesturing we do with our arms, none of the lower animals are going to be doing very much of, right? Because we've got free arms. Also, frowning, he says, that had to have started with us attempting to shade our eyes, right? To be able to look off in the distance. It only makes sense once we've stood up. And blushing requires self-consciousness, right? So I have no reason to blush if I'm not worried about what you're all thinking about me right now. So that's obviously going to be a very advanced kind of expression. Now, oh yeah. Wait. Now, I mentioned that these arguments are not that good, and Darwin is in large part conscious of this fact, to be fair to Darwin. So he describes an example, a really interesting example. If you're leading a sled on the ice, drawn by a pack of dogs, very often, if the dogs will in fact detect that the ice under them is thin, when they do so, they'll spread out. And Darwin says very often, even very experienced sled drivers won't have realized that the ice is thin until, in fact, they see the dogs spread. And so he says, this is a good example. Let's think about why this would have happened. How did this evolve, right? Did the dogs act thus from the experience of each individual? So is this individual learning that's taking place, right? Each dog maybe cracks the ice at one point in its life, and so it comes to understand that it's worried about the amount of weight that's being directed through the ice. From the example of the older and wiser dogs, is there sort of group learning that's taking place, right? Are the older dogs teaching the younger dogs to spread out? Or from some kind of inherited habit, from an instinct. And if it's an instinct, there's more than one way that it could be an instinct. So it could be a fairly recent instinct. He says maybe this only dates back to when people who lived in snowy climates started domesticating dogs and asking them to drive sleds. Or maybe it's really old. Maybe it goes all the way back to the Arctic wolves, the parent stock of the Eskimo dog. They may have acquired this instinct, impelling them not to attack their prey in a close pack when on thin ice. Questions of this kind are most difficult to answer, right? And so he's happy to admit that just seeing a behavior is good, but it leaves us with a bunch of very difficult questions, evolutionary questions that we still have to answer, and for which there's not great data, right? It's going to be very hard to tease out these kinds of questions. So now we come to Darwin's brief, but I think still compelling discussion of ethical theory. He is, of course, not a philosopher. I'm going to leave ethical theory in scare quotes up here. Darwin would probably be horrified if he knew that a group of philosophers were standing around in a room however many years later talking about his ethical theory. But he does write, so the following proposition seems to me in a high degree probable. Namely that any animal whatever endowed with well-marked social instincts would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well developed or nearly as well developed as in man. So what he's trying to build here is a picture of the gradual, continuous emergence of ethical norms from social behavior, right? As soon as you get smart enough, species, to be able to have a sufficiently robust kind of social structure, you're going to evolve something that looks a lot like a moral sense. Again, just like the gradients that we've talked about in mental and emotional capacities. He's much more hesitant, I think, to talk about there being a gradient here, whereas he's very forthright about his continuity thesis in all of the other cases. I think he's uncertain just how much reasoning capacity this needs, so he's uncertain whether or not he wants to say that it's a gradient that would be instantiated anywhere else. I think he's also sort of cognizant of being out of his depth, of talking about things that he's not an expert in. He reads primarily secondary sources on ethics, and so this is not his forte. But he does have an argument for this. So what is it about social behavior that will produce ethical norms? First and foremost, sympathy, right? For Darwin, the moral sense is about sympathy. It's about being able to understand what it is that a fellow organism would want, and thereby to understand in turn when you are denying them that. When you are denying them that unjustly, when you would feel bad, when you would feel wronged if someone had done the same to you. This first bullet point should be really, really old news for anyone who's experienced with 19th century British ethics. Because this gentleman That is Adam Smith, of course now primarily known as an economist, as an economic theorist for writing The Wealth of Nations. Barely anybody read The Wealth of Nations in the 19th century. The book of Smith's that they read was The Theory of Moral Sentiment. But Darwin read The Theory of Moral Sentiment himself. He thought it was one of the best things in philosophy that he'd ever read. He also read the first and second critiques, if I'm remembering right. He read at least a fair portion of Kant in translation, and didn't talk about it a lot afterward. So he gets a lot out of Smith's treatment of the moral sentiment, and Smith, again, is precisely, this is exactly the same idea that Smith has in trying to think about the moral sentiment as arising from sympathy with your fellow beings. Now, Darwin's going to be able to ground this sympathy a little bit, though, in certain kinds of evolved behaviors. So what he wants to say is, sympathy is going to be reinforced over time. It's going to be supported because probably if you have that enough mental capacity to be sympathetic with others, you also are going to have enough to be able to recollect and judge past actions, right? So he says, what would be worse, what is worse than getting to the end of the day, looking back over your actions for the day, and realizing that you did not hold yourself to the standard of sympathy that you know that you could have, right? That's going to be a really powerful driver to get you to actually act in the right kind of way, at least for properly functioning sympathetic organisms. Of course, at some point, if language fully evolves, we're going to be able to communicate those social norms via language. So you won't only be sort of on your own as regards sympathy, you'll also be instructed in what your culture believes is appropriate targets of sympathy and when. And over time, and again, we're back to the continuity thesis. This is why I'm presenting all of this as of one whole cloth for Darwin. Those social instincts will solidify into habits and be inherited, Darwin thinks. So eventually it will be the case that your culture has been moral in the way that it has been for so long now that your offspring are just born with an instinct to be moral of the appropriate sort, right? That is to say, if there's any way to select for it, it saves you the time of having to teach it to your children, right? How much better would it be if we didn't have to instruct our offspring in morality? They just came out with a moral sense. That would be good for the species. Might solve several kinds of problems. So, one thing that is a little weird about this, though, and Darwin actually fully embraces this, he bites this bullet completely, is that this is going to make the moral sense, in at least some sense, species relative. So this is a very famous passage this gets quoted a lot. But Darwin says, if, for instance, to take an extreme case, men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. Nevertheless, the bee, or any other social animal, would in our supposed case gain, and I think it's interesting, right? He's gone from men raised as bees to just bees, but then he says, oh wait, no, it's only a supposition, it's just hypothetical, right? Would gain, as it appears to me, some feeling of right and wrong or a conscience. I think he's intentionally being ambiguous here. I think he genuinely isn't sure whether or not he actually believes that bees have a conscience. I think what he's done is he's actually written up a very good argument that bees, in fact, do have a conscience, and then he sort of realized that and gone, oh, I don't know that I want to agree to that. So he kind of walks it back a little bit. But I think the ambiguity is deep, but the ambiguity is in some sense instructive, right? So the reason that I wanted to sort of get here is to say, oh, right, sorry, I apologize. I'm off by a slide.
Could I ask
oh, yes, yeah.
a question?
Yeah.
So he says that the moral sense is inevitable in any social creature. You gave arguments that sympathy, if it appears, would be reinforced. But why the moral sense would be inevitable? Does he give us an argument? Does he give an argument about that?
Nothing beyond the idea that once you were able to sympathize,
Okay.
you're off to the races. Right? I think he thinks that as soon as you get the ability to sort of feel that feeling of wronging someone else, the rest is just details.
Okay. So he thinks that social structure are extremely unstable if you don't have sympathy, or something like that.
That's a good question. I mean, social structures of the kind of complex nature that we're talking about in a human case, I think. And there's an interesting question in bees. I mean, when you can enforce it with murder instead of sympathy, maybe you're okay without sympathy. And I think that may be why this ambiguity persists, right? Is that he's trying to say, well, you know, I mean, if you kill everyone that disagrees with you, I guess that's one way to coerce agreement, right? So yeah, but no, I think you're right. I mean, I think he does think that at bottom, what holds human society together is sympathy. Yes.
So in Darwin's mind, is that feelings that brings man from nature to culture? What's the the opposition between nature and culture?
I think Darwin.
You spoke about social instincts.
Right.
But is sociability an instinct?
Good.
Or is it learned?
Now this is a bit tough. I have to sort of put on my Darwin impersonator hat, because the idea of the emergence of culture as an institution, and then by extension, the evolutionary account that we might have to give of the emergence of culture as an institution, isn't really on Darwin's radar screen here. But that said, I find it hard to believe that what Darwin wouldn't do here is exactly what he's done in these other cases, and try to make a continuity argument. And essentially to say, well, this is a kind of bee culture. It's a very strange kind of culture. It's communicated in a very funny way. But it's a sort of culture. It's not a culture like our culture. Cultures like our culture seem to rely on, at the very least, articulate language. But it is a kind of culture. There are, of course, really interesting questions. This opens you on now to the very, very active contemporary field of cultural evolution. So there are some really exciting questions being debated right now about, is that account really sustainable? And what does it take to sustain it? That's a very hard thing to work out in the details, it turns out. It's way more complicated than a sort of Richard Dawkins picture of a meme and kind of stopping there, right? You have to get way more sophisticated. So that would, but no, I think the point stands. I think Darwin would smear that out, just as he smeared out all these other capacities.
Would you say that because of sexual selection? Because when you discuss natural selection, there's not a lot of arguments about possible culture in that sense, but when you discuss sexual selection more.
We could get trends.
Yeah.
Right. Missed it. Too slow. We could get trends in a sexual selection context. There could be fads, right, in a way that it doesn't seem like natural selection would enable us to do. Oh, it did. Maybe. Yes. Yes. And there's the beat. Oh, no. Angry. Sorry. No,
please continue.
Actually, I need my last slide. And here we get to what for Darwin is a side point, but is the culmination of what I wanted to present today, although I hope this will make sense. But Darwin says sympathy beyond the confines of man. He's talking about the sort of very last, most sophisticated kinds of ethics, ethical imperatives. Sympathy beyond the confines of man, that is, humanity to lower animals, seems to be one of the latest moral acquisitions. It's one of the last things that we evolved. This virtue, one of the noblest with which man is endowed seems to arise incidentally from our sympathies becoming more tender and more widely diffused until they are extended to all sentient beings. And what I hope you can see by this point is that in some sense this is a completely unsurprising conclusion for Darwin to draw, given the way that he structured his entire approach to mental capacity, to emotional expression, to moral sentiment throughout the human and animal kingdoms, right? I think this is a really natural thing. Darwin has built himself a very delightfully consistent picture. To what extent it can be supported is supported in a contemporary, both biological and philosophical context is a separate issue, but a delightfully consistent picture of a way to ground a moral and ethical world in which it'd be really odd for him to say that we didn't have ethical obligations to non-human animals in this kind of context, and for that matter, that there aren't varieties of ethical obligations floating around among the more highly equipped, Darwin hated that kind of phrase and then used it all the time, the more highly equipped members of the lower animals. So that's what we'll leave the story for today. I hope you've gotten a good idea of Darwin's picture of the sort of integrated relationship between behaviors, mental capacities, emotions, the moral sentiment, the ethical world. I think it's a really fruitful way to kind of open a way of thought about these kinds of obligations. Again, I think there's obvious, it should also be obvious at this point that there are a host of difficulties that you have to resolve to be able to make a picture like this actually work. But also I hope it's obvious that it's a really interesting and kind of appealing way to think about the interrelationships. At the very least, it's a wonderfully destructive take on human exceptionalism, which I at least am sympathetic with. I'm sympathetic with the destruction that is. And I think it also just could provide us a really nice jumping off point for thinking about ethics as part of this massive continuum in which we sit as an element of the animal kingdom. All right, happy to take questions. Thanks. Go ahead.
Maybe I have a quick answer to start with. It's about clarification of terms, because Darwin seemed to use sympathy and not empathy. And I wonder if that makes a difference for Darwin, because nowadays we study a lot empathy, for instance, with mirror neurons, and some things that can be a way to relate to someone else. So I wonder just what's the difference?
That is a fantastic question. In fact, I had the thought this afternoon, after it was too late for me to think about changing the talk, that I should go search through Darwin's text for the word empathy, because it doesn't appear in any of his discussions of sympathy. And I wonder, my suspicion is that this is merely linguistic. The way that he speaks of sympathy sounds a lot like the way that we talk about empathy. So my suspicion is that this is merely linguistic, although I need to get back to you on that, because I agree. This remains one of my open questions about this. I wish I knew more about late 19th century English language usage in this context, because I don't. But it's a very good question. You're right. I mean, the shortest answer is the way he talks about sympathy winds up sounding a lot like empathy.
Thanks a lot for your talk. So I have a question. So the question is directed at you, but also at Darwin. So in fact, I would like you to engage in some kind of rational reconstruction of Darwin. According to you/Darwin, what makes a representation ethical or judgment ethical? Because in the hypothetical society of super intelligent beings who are intelligent enough to have some kind of sophisticated representations, they would develop a feeling of right and wrong, but this feeling of right and wrong would be directed at acts that we would judge very differently.
Right.
So they would have some kind of ethical representation.
Yeah.
At the same time, this ethical representation would be very different from ours. It would obviously not be based on sympathy. So even though I'm sure Darwin does not speak explicitly about it, if we try to reconstruct it, what does it take for something to be a kind of ethical representation and not just any kind of motivational representation? Because I suppose that not any motivational representation does the trick.
Good, good, no, yes. A little bit of reconstruction involved, but not much, because of course this is a general problem for any kind of moral sense theory, right? So you're going to be stuck with this really interesting question of where normativity actually shows up. This is a place, yes. For Darwin, I think Darwin is philosophically unsophisticated enough that sort of the importance of the ascription of normativity to a judgment, or even normativity as a sort of phenomenological experience, a felt feeling of an ought. I don't think he understands, I don't think he catches that that's an important thing that his account isn't offering. That said, the majority of people who have picked up a theory like this and tried to run with it, and perhaps the best exemplar of this that I know of is Michael Ruse, who, for his part, just, again, bites this bullet completely, and has to be an error theorist about the feeling of normativity. So, of course, it's good for humans if, by being sympathetic with you, I, in fact, right now, choose not to murder you. It would be even better if I feel like I shouldn't. So, variations that favored the development of a feeling of normativity would be favored over time. This is weird, right? This is weird and probably proper. Not, I won't say, it is completely consistent. There's not necessarily a problem here. There's not necessarily a problem in just going full error theory. A lot of people do. But at the same time, there's probably a reason that it's a deeply unpopular position among professional ethicists, right? It's not like there are legions of error theorists in the world. It is, there's something odd about renouncing our feeling, our very real feeling of normative force. But I think if we're going to be consistent in extending this kind of a line, we're not going to have any other choice. I think it's error theory all the way down.
Okay. Can I just quick follow up?
Yeah.
No, I agree, and by the way, I'm not sure error theory is so rare among, especially meta-ethicists. I feel like lots of meta-ethicists.
That's true.
Error theory maybe the most elegant way to go, so we'll embrace that. Just a quick follow-up. So let's say that we have this coherent Darwinian picture of moral, and so we end up being error theories about value and things like that. So how should we feel about expanding our sympathy to animals? So it's not going to give rise to true judgments, but anyway, our normative judgments about humans are not true as they are all false anymore. So do we have any way to assess whether or not it's a good idea to extend sympathy to animals? Why not go further? Why not go to rocks? Or why not just stick to humans? Is there any way to assess that, or is it just no? I suppose.
Darwin's not going to give you one. In the way, in the kind of, be precise here. At the level of the picture that I've presented to you here, Darwin's not going to give you one. He thinks all of that work is going to be done, and he refers to sentient beings, which seems to entail that he thinks there's some point past which you're not going to be able to have sympathy with something.
Non-sentient being.
Yeah. So you're just not going to be able to sympathize with a chair. This, of course, in the 21st century context, seems like a pretty dangerous assumption. I haven't heard an update, but I feel really bad for the fact that we haven't heard from the Mars rover Opportunity in like a month and a half, and I'm really sad about it. Like, I'm actually sad about this. Like, I am sympathetic with a robot on Mars. So maybe it's not as impossible as Darwin thought it was.
But just for precision, do you know if he read David Hume? Because there's this
should know that, and I don't.
David Hume, because David Hume attributed mental state to animals, which is
Yeah.
super weird for a skeptic,
Yeah.
and defended the moral sentiment.
So I can be, let me put it this way. I don't know if you read Hume in the primary. I know, though, that he was reading all the primary texts of moral theory at the time. So I know he was exposed to Hume as a secondary source. Now, to what extent those secondary sources would have picked up on this and actually reported it, that's going to be a bit more of a challenge. Or for that matter, if Darwin had read the primary, what he would have taken from it. He doesn't take great notes when he's reading these more difficult philosophical texts. So it's a bit difficult to say. I mean, he's reading people like Mackintosh's Ethics, I believe, is the big mid-19th century British textbook that is his sort of go-to for this kind of thing. Guarantee you Hume's going to be in there.
Yeah.
But at what kind of detail?
Very specific.
Yeah, no, it's a good question though. That's a really cool question actually.
Yeah. Okay. So there's this interesting argumentative strategy that, great talk by the way, I learned a lot from it, that when you try to put this bright line between humans and animals, he sort of shows that some animals have the capacity, but also that some humans don't have the capacity. So this is just a question because I'm curious about whether you have this in Darwin with respect to the moral sense as well. You've sort of shown that he shows that it looks like some animals could have a moral sense, but does he also ever talk about human beings that lack fellow feeling or empathy?
My recollection, in my exposure to the text, no. And this is a very interesting point, right? You know, the idea that it certainly seems like there are, I mean, we know that there are pathological cases.
Psychopathy is what
Yeah, a fair number of them where, yes, exactly, one of the primary ways in which that's expressed is a lack of empathy. It's not clear to me that Darwin would see that as a problem because Darwin helps himself to a pretty robust kind of proper functioning picture.
Well, it would help his case, actually.
Grounded. No, it would. I mean, grounded in a kind of, because he's got such a robust understanding of adaptation that he can help himself to a pretty robust kind of proper function theory about what you are adapted to do in the way that an organism ought to work. And he might be able to dodge it all that way. So sort of put a little asterisk there, that quote about, you know, once you get enough mental capacities. Well, once you get enough mental capacities and they work right, then you're going to be sympathetic with others. Otherwise, there's something wrong with you. He might be able to get what he needs from there. Of course, again, that's opening yet another front of attack from a contemporary philosophical perspective, because, of course, proper function theories are, again, easy to say in 5 seconds and really, really, really hard to work out in the actual detail. So I think that's what Darwin would do. I think you're welcome to find that unfulfilling, particularly if you're already a skeptic about proper function.
Non, merci beaucoup, hein. C'est tout à fait passionnant. Je peux parler français? Je suis suffisamment aise. Donc, on sait que la Darwin est très marquée par le principe de continuité, au fond, et voilà. Mais est-ce qu'on ne peut pas penser, est-ce que chez Darwin, hein, il y a une double question, hein, chez Darwin, est-ce que en présent, mais est-ce que chez Darwin, le concept de seuil n'est pas présent? Parce qu'au fond, on peut très bien avoir une continuité développementale avec des seuils. On peut quand même une évidence dans l'évolution de l'individu, hein, entre un bébé de 6 mois et un gamin de 5 ans et un adulte, il y a stricte continuité, et pourtant il y a des seuils, il y a une continuité développementale qui n'est pas incompatible avec des seuils sur le plan cognitif, sur le plan... Au fond, est-ce que cette idée d'une continuité par petits pas, mais avec néanmoins des seuils, on la trouve chez Darwin?
This is it's a very difficult question. Sorry, I'm going to respond in English, I apologize.
Yeah, no problem.
This is a very difficult thing to pin down. in Darwin. So the question of individual development, of individual, the sort of course of an individual life through Darwin's own kind of perspective.
Donc je prends l'exemple individuel pour montrer qu'il y a clairement une continuité et des discontinuités.
Right.
C'est analogique. Bon, d'ailleurs, on ne trouve pas ça chez Darwin, mais je veux dire, Darwin est clairement un continuiste. Il est en réaction contre le dualisme, donc c'est clair qu'il va complètement dans ce sens-là. Il veut dire, il pousse loin dans ce sens-là précisément parce qu'on sent bien que la tonalité dominante est dualiste. Hein, et là, je comprends complètement. Mais d'une certaine manière, est-ce que on pourrait quand même concevoir, ma question est ouverte, je n'en sais rien, qu'il introduise le concept de seuil dans une dynamique évolutive, et notamment à propos du langage, parce que c'est cette sous-question, au fond. On peut parler du langage, mais est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un sens à dire qu'il y a quand même une complexité du langage humain dans l'articulation des grammaires qu'on ne trouve pas dans... Alors, on peut voir le langage humain comme un processus qui vient du langage animal. Au fond, c'est un langage animal plus sophistiqué. Mais est-ce que le concept de seuil ne permet pas de penser une certaine discontinuité à l'intérieur de processus continus? Au fond, c'est un peu ça.
Good, yes.
So you need a translation? Or
No, I think I'm here.
Oui, excuse-moi.
I just don't think Darwin's going to find that compelling. I don't think Darwin finds. I don't think Darwin sees any relevant evidence that there would be enough there to ground at that kind of discontinuity. I think he's just going to dig in his heels and say that there's just not suitable material to make that kind of an inference. And again, I think you're welcome to find that very unfulfilling. But I don't think I think there's just a deep and inescapable kind of fundamentally and sort of completely biological nature to the kind of picture that Darwin is drawing. I don't think I think exactly the reason that he's interested in these kinds of continuity theses is because he thinks that's all the resources that he needs, and he thinks that's all the resources that he has. And it's a very... Well, no more, again, he's not going to... He's neither going to help himself to any kind of non-naturalistic explanation in a human case or an animal case, right?
Et dans le même sens, le concept de culture, est-ce qu'on trouve dans les textes de Darwin?
Yes and no. I mean, this comes back to what Alex was saying a bit ago. Yes, but in a very thin notion. He has this idea that, you know, there might be trends, there might be, he can talk about a preference, right? He's happy to talk about preferences, and maybe if a culture is just an aggregation of a lot of those small parts, then yes. But if a culture, if you want to ground a more robust analysis, again, with respect to these cultural evolutionary kinds of contexts that we've talked about, that more robust notion is not present there, I don't think. Atomistic, reductive, I mean, that is for better and worse. You know, another way to put, or to very briefly summarize the entire talk might be to say, you know, Darwin has developed a tool and he thinks he finds application for it everywhere. Absolutely generally, right? He sees no reason not to think that this selective, simple, trait-powered, fairly atomistic, fairly organismic-centered picture isn't just going to work for everything.
Maybe I have one more question.
Yeah.
Is when you spoke about the attempts to ground moral feeling on sympathy, there were 4 conditions. One of them seemed to me, in some sense, unnecessary. It was the capability to produce norms thanks to language. So I wonder first, how do we define language in this specific context? Of course, if language is defined in a very wide sense, it seems to be obvious. But on the other hand, if language is something like being able to verbalize, it seems to be not necessary and even not easy to defend. For instance, I'm thinking about behaviorists. They try to explain moral behavior, not, of course, state of mind, but at least behavior without using verbalized capability. So I just wonder if there were a discussion about this aspect.
Yeah, so I think it's important to see the role that that's playing in Darwin's argument. So those are, sympathy I think is a necessary condition, and it might even be equivalent to the moral sense, depending on exactly how you read it. Those other 3 things are more sort of things that are very likely to evolve, and when they evolve, they're going to make the moral sense more robust. They're going to be things that you can add to the basic feeling of sympathy to produce stronger sort of moral institutions, right? So sure, it will be rare that you can communicate a social norm to a fellow organism. But once you can, it's a really good thing to be able to do, right? And it makes your moral intuitions much more stable in the long term, much more powerful. And that's the sense in which Darwin brings out those other 3 conditions, right? He's trying to say, these are things that will help. They aren't things that you have to have, but they're things that are very likely to appear. We know they've appeared in the human case. And they're going to make things much easier.
Right. Because maybe in moral, you can even find some people who define the moral consciousness is not always able to verbalize its content in some way. That maybe if you are intuitionist moral, you will say, okay, you can feel in yourself that this is good, even if you cannot always explain it rationally. So that's also,
yeah.
I mean, this brings a specific conception of what morality is. This wasn't specified.
Good. No, I think you're right. I think since Darwin isn't necessarily committing himself to that being a requirement for the development of the moral sense, he could still ground this kind of more emotive or intuitionistic picture. And actually, I think if he'd been exposed to a theory like that, he might have very much liked it, given his other connections to sort of moral emotion. But I think this also has to do with his context for thinking about moral theory, right? You've got to think of the late 19th century context as being all about, there's a moral law with dictates. The moral law is very easily expressible in linguistic terms, right? It's a set of normative injunctions. We have to figure out how to understand how we got them. And so in that kind of context, it's not surprising that he might have added that. That's what I would say.
Une autre question, mais alors c'est peut-être plus général. La place du concept de sélection naturelle dans les œuvres tardives. Je ne sais pas si vous connaissez la thèse de Patrick Thor à Paris, qui dit qu'en effet, au fond, qu'il n'y a pas de vraiment. Sa thèse veut dire que dans les œuvres tardives, la sélection naturelle vaut pour l'origine des espèces, mais chez l'humain, au fond, c'est la solidarité qui a été sélectionnée. Bon, c'est une thèse assez controversée. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de la place de la sélection naturelle dans les œuvres tardives précises, dans les deux derniers bouquins de Darwin?
Good. Yes, I mean, this is a controversial question. Why did he introduce sexual selection in the second half of the Descent? How much work did he think it was doing? Was it replacing natural selection? Or on the inverse, is sexual selection actually just a species of natural selection? And a sort of way that natural selection could work? And so how selective are these explanations, right? That's a really good question. I'm not sure that Darwin himself is clear in these works about it, because you see both, on the one hand, you'll see him say things like, in the very last quote about the animals, he says, well, incidentally, it would happen that we would become sympathetic to the other animals. Well, that's clearly not the way he talks about selection. That's clearly non-selective. There's something else. That's sort of, wow, this thing that selection built, it's also being applied somewhere else. At the same time, there are certainly moments when he speaks of trying to think of the right way to phrase this. I think the more biological, the more fundamental the example for him, the more confident he is in his selective explanation. So if you go back, for instance, to some of the earliest stuff on habit in The Origin, there he's very concerned to say habits could absolutely be influenced, could be given a selective explanation. They could be crafted by purely by simple selective pressure. The more complex he gets, the less often it is that he refers in specific cases to a selective explanation, which is why you get this question. It's why this question remains open, because it becomes difficult to try to figure out, is he leaving those details open because he just doesn't know them at a very precise level, because he can't give you the story that he wants to give you, but if he could, it would be natural selection? Or is he leaving them open because, again, as he is very quick to say, he edits the introduction to The Origin of Species to conclude with the claim in the later editions that selection is one, but by no means the only force causing organisms and populations to change. So we're going to be stuck, I think it's very hard to decide this question of whether he's leaving them open and the details would be natural selection, or he's leaving them open and the details would be something else. We know, at the very least, that till the end of his career, I at least find compelling the argument that over all of his writings, from the very earliest notebooks to the very last stuff, he maintains a fairly constant, fairly stable belief that use and disuse of characters, Lamarckianism, could and does cause change. So that's always sitting on the shelf, available for him to use in an explanation if he wants it. And so when he's not clear, it's very hard to reconstruct the details.
But it's something I'm always, and you know these books better than mine, I'm always puzzled about the question of François on the source of normativity. Because if we follow what you're saying and follow Darwin, so the moral sense is it's just a product of evolution.
Right.
But there's many bizarre passages, like, oh, the mother self-sacrificing is so cool and extraordinary and admirable and aesthetics and, oh yeah, the gentry, blah, 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 blah. So there seems to be a level of morality that is coherent with biology, and this other level of discussion in Darwin about that seems to say, okay, of course, these blah, blah, blah capability comes from nature, but on the other hand, we can have a judgment about them, we can choose them for aesthetic reason, and these reasons are based on something else. Mm-hmm. And why I'm very puzzled about that Because we can say that it's unsophisticated from Darwin, but we have exactly the same thing in Hume. So Hume says, of course, the moral sentiment is completely arbitrary, but on the other hand, once we know this thing, we should educate children that way, to be sure that they won't become, bees. And it doesn't say bees, but it's the idea that we have another ethical theory over it, controlling the moral sentiment by education. That's clear in Hume, but in Darwin it's almost the same. He passed a lot of passages admiring self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
He has an argument for cooperation. He has no argument for self-sacrifice. If we generalize self-sacrifice, he seems to admire that for aesthetic reason or whatever. So how do you make sense of this question?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. My favorite example of a text like this, he has the bit at the end of, I think it's Origins chapter 2 or 3, where he says, gosh, and how terrible is it? You've got these awful things that nature does, like the parasitic wasp that lays its egg in the back of the caterpillar that then burrows out of it alive to be born, and how awful nature is. But then it's okay because most organisms die quickly and painlessly. And you're like, wait, where did any of that come from? Like, what is you've just argued that all of this is perfectly natural, and now you turn around on it and you say, well, we can sleep well at night because we know that death is usually quick and painless. Wow. So I struggle with exactly the same thing. I mean, I struggle with exactly the same kind of question, and I'm not going to have a particularly enlightening answer for you. I mean, at some point, this is perhaps at the most extreme. If I can guess what I'm pretty sure he would say. I think this is the part of the argument where Michael Ruse would say, "He's a British Victorian. What more do you want from him? Victorian Britain was the era of progress. Everything was going to get better forever." Right? And he's a creature of his environment. And there's a sense in which that's a really compelling picture.
But would you say that these passages seems to argue that at some point in evolution you go outside? You become something else.
I don't think he would want to argue for that on purpose.
Of course. So that's
I don't think, and in fact, I don't think I would go so far as to say when pressed on this, and occasionally when he presses himself on this, he renounces these kinds of claims. So you'll see little jottings in the margins of books or in his notebooks where he'll say things like, never say higher and lower. Higher and lower is imposed by us. There's nothing that, we are in no sense higher than any of the other animals. We're all products of evolution. And then he spends, again, Expression of the Emotions is one of his last books. He spends the whole time talking about the lower animals and our higher emotional capacities. And so he falls right back into this stuff that he tells himself in writing, don't do that anymore. And so I do have a hard time in just not having to appeal to a little bit of personal inconsistency on that head. I mean, it pains me to do it because in many ways, a lot of the writing that I've done about Darwin, I think in most cases, he's a far more careful and attentive and very good reader, in particular of things like 19th century British philosophy, than he's often given credit for. I think he's really careful. I think he's exceptionally smart. I think he would have made a great philosopher. Would have been a waste, probably, but that's fine. Better that he did what he did. But in this case, I have to think that it's just, maybe it's even just sort of a way of speaking, a way of presentation that he just kind of can't break himself out of. I don't know, but I don't have a good answer to the question.
Do you think that Darwin would agree to envisage just sympathy and morality or normativity as, two components of, something like a virtuous cycle? Sympathy reinforcing
normativity, and normativity being something like not a higher, it's hard to avoid this term, not a higher faculty, but a more abstract faculty to learn, for instance, of being sympathetic in some circumstances, when you're on trial or something, like a play, and this could reinforce, I mean, your feelings in the proper situation, or being nice when you have to, if you have the right training in school, from your parents to learn the moral laws, I don't know.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm broadly sympathetic with that. I don't think there's anything inconsistent with Darwin in what you just said.
No,
because in essence, what we're having to do now is speculate about if we could properly present him with the question of normativity, where would he go? I like that idea, if only because it's a bit more sophisticated than just a brute error theory. It might still, in the long run, in a meta-ethical sense, it might just be a slightly fancier class of error theory. We still may be stuck in the error theory trap. I'd have to think harder about that. But yeah, I think that kind of an option's open to me.
Yes, you were concentrated on Darwin, why not? But in general, so in his context, he would probably he wanted to claim against like theologians and so on. But if we forget this and just ask in a contemporary context, so can we say that his theory fails, and in which cases? So we would be like this normativity or language or culture, and should his theory be comprehensive? Is it the problem that it doesn't explain everything? If it works for some cases, maybe it's good already, especially that he admits himself that maybe there can be other causes as well. And secondly, what is like a philosophical dimension here? Because can't we say that to some extent, whether some capacity comes from selection or something else, isn't it a biological question or a historical question, like it comes from culture and so on, rather than philosophical? So what is a philosophical dimension here?
Good, okay, let me take both those in turn. I think they're both great questions. As regards the contemporary status, yeah, I mean, I think, as is always the case with the view of a historical figure, to turn it into a contemporary competitor requires fleshing it out in some kind of way that is both consistent with what Darwin does and responsive to all of the counterexamples that we now know one could deploy against theories like this, because they've been done before. I think once you do that, again, the most consistent and complete attempt that I know of to do this is Ruse's. You get a perfectly functional theory of ethics. You get a theory that has some very unsatisfying elements. You get, a possibly troubling, depending on your opinions about normativity, you get a possibly troubling picture of normativity. You get a possibly troubling kind of species or evolutionary trajectory relative nature of morality, right? But if you're willing to accept those strange features, you get a theory that's not obviously trivially refuted. You get a very weird theory. Now, this is immediately sort of intimately related to your second question about the sort of empirical or epistemic status of the theory. And you're exactly right. I mean, a number of these questions are made much sharper by adding a bunch of contemporary empirical data. So, for example, Darwin, who is hypothesizing by looking at behaviors, We can now amplify that and say, actually, yes, when your dog is angry and you are angry, the same brain regions are active. Right? There is a very nice evolutionary homology to many of the kind of broad core emotional displays. But Darwin had no idea of that, right? That's a very contemporary piece of empirical data. The philosophical upshot, though, I think the philosophical payoff is that Darwin's picture encourages us to think in a very provocative way about the implications of taking all of these continuity theses very seriously. Right? I think that's Darwin's biggest service to us in this regard. I think he forces you to think, whether you think his examples are great or not, or his arguments are great or not, he forces you to think about, well, if there really is just no genuine sense whatsoever in which you can put a bright line around humans and prize us out of the lower animals, what happens? Right? What happens philosophically? What is the philosophical upshot of that? I gestured at what I think Darwin thought. One of the things that I think Darwin thought the upshot was, you get continuity in moral sense too. But I also think, and this is why I thought this seemed like a decent topic for today in the context of the seminar, I think it's really interesting to take that continuity seriously throughout our approach to the question of the relationship between humans and animals, to the question of the relationship between humans and ecology, humans and the climate. I think really acknowledging that continuity thesis is, or ought to be, can be, an important part of the way that we think about those problems. So, I for one am excited to come to the rest of the meetings of the seminar.
Can I just say just a small thing? So this functional theory also implies continuity?
It at least implies good. It at least implies common descent. And if there's common descent and common function, if there's proper homology, in my seminar there'll probably be a talk on homology in a few months. Watch this space. If there's proper homology, it does seem like it would be strange then to use that same character as a clear, unambiguous separation, right, between you and another creature that possesses something that's basically homologous and even works in basically the same way still. And that's the kind of continuity thesis Darwin wants. It's not even homology like the homology between arms and wings, which are homologous but used for very dramatically different purposes. It's even tighter than that. It's the homology between, my jaw and the jaw of a horse. We use them to eat stuff. Cool. That it seems is a bit more robust of a kind of continuity.
Any questions?
Yes.
if no one has questions, then maybe I can push a little bit more on the error theory problem.
Oh, sure.
So
yeah.
you were saying that, according to you, the most coherent interpretation of Darwin's view is that there are all kinds of possible. I make my own formulation.
Please.
There are all kinds of possible ethical system of ethical representations. The one we are, the one intelligent beings would have, and they are all giving rise to wrong judgments. They will all give rise to judgment about what is right and what is wrong, and all these judgments will be false. Because this is how I interpret the concept of error theory. Moral judgments have a truth value, and this truth value is always false.
Okay, good. So error theory might not be quite if this is my poor training in meta-ethics appearing. If that's what that's true, so in that sense, it depends on exactly how you want to formulate the content of the judgment, right? If the content of the judgment is supposed to be, it is wrong to kill your fertile daughter, period, full stop, globally wrong. Yes, false, right? So error theory in that sense. But you could also perform a sort of mass reinterpretation of these claims, right? And it's not quite cultural relativism when you do, because of course it's not culturally relative. We don't get to choose what species we're born into or what the human sense of sympathy would act like.
Of course. Yes.
So it's species relative, which is it's a kind of relativism, I guess, but it's a very weird kind of relativism.
No, of course, I understand that was, yes, that's another possible interpretation, but I was worried that it was not entirely coherent with the way Darwin was putting it. Because of course we could say, well, when we use good, we don't really know what it means, but if we could say what good refers to what usually improves cooperation amongst humans. But then you would not say that bees would have a feeling of right and wrong. You would have to say that bees have a feeling of right star and wrong star. I mean, I doubt Darwin would talk like a 21st century analytic. Yeah, that's what he would have to say. But it seems to me that he wanted to say, I mean, if we reconstruct what he's saying, that no, bees would talk about right and wrong. So if we accept that, if we take that seriously, that only leaves, I think, two doors open, either error theory, or why not go with emotivism or some kind of expressivism about morals. Maybe that's the most coherent way to go.
That's a really interesting idea. So you could cast them as just expressivist against the moral sense, which he's already developed. And so essentially all I'm telling you is, yes, I believe what you said is consistent with my moral sense. No, I do not believe what you said is consistent with my moral sense.
Yeah, so expression of imperatives or emotion. Don't do that.
This is, I would have to think harder. Here I would have, well, actually, and not so much think, to try to figure out which one of these I think is more consistent with Darwin. I would want to unpack more, which I did not have time to do for this. He's got two notebooks where from very early on in his career he starts collecting every time he has a thought about ethics or what he considers to be a very close kin metaphysics, but in that late 19th century British sense of just philosophy things, right? So he collects a bunch of notes there, and I would want to go consult them and see if we can drive Darwin apart on these two positions. My temptation, so the reason that I go more to the kind of species relativist error theory angle is my temptation is to say, and again, this goes back to kind of putting him into that Victorian context, that he would be dissuaded by the idea of those propositions not having truth values, that's really the way that he's got this kind of rigid, law-driven, propositional content kind of ethical flavor. That's why I incline that way. But it would be really interesting. It would be really interesting for him to see him deal with some examples, as I think he probably does in those notes, that might start to let us understand more clearly where he comes down on.
Yeah, just two quick follow-up. First, I agree with you that I doubt very much that Darwin would agree with some kind of expressivism even first, because I don't think the option was really available in the philosophical market at the time.
Yeah, I don't think so.
And same with I think even if it was presented to him, I'm sure he would say no. But one advantage of this kind of view is that it allows him, potentially him, to escape the charge of irrationality, because then, if we have an emotivist conception of moral judgments, then it's not absurd to say, well, moral judgment comes from this thing and it's species relative, and it's great to do this and it's great to do that, and it's good because in that case you're not asserting anything about the world, you're just expressing some kind of stance. So it's not irrational.
Yeah, no, that's a very nice idea. Yeah, no, we should talk more about it because it'd be a neat way to extend what Darwin does. It'd be a neat sort of support or a way to try to unpack. If there's a way to kind of coherently interpret what he's doing and extend it in that direction, it'd be really fun. It'd be really fun to think about. Like I say, as you say, because it'd be fun to think about precisely because it's always interesting to find a case where you've got something with which, I don't think Darwin would agree with it at all, but if it actually is consistent in interesting ways with the way that he structured his system, it could be really fun.
I want to come back to the continuity. So of course Darwin, and you didn't put the pictures of a baby disappointed and a monkey disappointed, and it says it's the same muscles and look, it's the same. But when he says the same, I'm often puzzled about that, because does he say it's the same emotion or it's functionally the same? Because there's the same distinction in Aristotle, where Aristotle says, yeah, there's some emotion that are the same, some mental state that are the same to certain animals, but in animals that are farther from us, it's still the same, but in an analogous way. So it's functionally the same. So the anger of a crab and the anger of a monkey and our anger, in what way is Darwin saying that because of the emotion is in part, the mental state is in part the facial expression, right. It's not separated. It's the same, or it's analogous, or it's functionally the same?
Good. A couple of things that I'll have to say about that. Probably none of them super thrilling, but I'll do what I can. The first thing to say is, so this is going to connect up to a long-standing debate about, well, homology in general, but then in particular, how does Darwin actually understand what's going on in regards to homology? And there's some evidence. So the context that Darwin is writing in is really confused about homologies. You've got one of Darwin's primary opponents is Richard Owen. Richard Owen is a neo-Kantian. Owen writes a very detailed theory of the archetype that is a very strong, very clear precursor to Darwin's thoughts about homology. So he tries to draw the form in a very kind of Goethe way of the vertebrate, right? And then talk about how all the other vertebrates are modifications of the vertebrate pattern. But then following Whewell's really weird neo-Kantianism, Owen starts to bend some weird neo-Kantianism into all of that in a way that I don't fully understand, and I can take solace in the fact that Darwin also says in the historical sketch at the beginning of the later editions of The Origin that Darwin doesn't understand it either. He at first thinks that Owen is supportive of selection and writes as much in his book, and then Owen hates him. They have a massive feud, and so he writes in the thing like, I guess I was mistaken, and it was in a lovely backhanded compliment. He says, I can take solace from the fact that everyone else is as confused by Professor Owen's writings as I am. I'm just like, ooh, ow. So you've got that kind of essentially neo-romantic, late romantic, German influenced understanding of what a homology might look like. Wherein it's really hard to answer the question you just asked. Right? In what sense is participating in the vertebrate being the same thing? Right? I don't even begin to know. At the same time, Darwin is of course breaking with that tradition some because he's going to give them an evolutionary grounding, and so you've got to figure out what Darwin thinks about homology. But then you also touch on what functional homologies might look like, so you've also got to think about to what extent Darwin actually has a robust teleology. And that's also, well, that's the matter of like open warfare in the Darwin studies community. So you have both people who say, now what's not up for dispute is that Darwin talks all the time like there are real functions. The question is whether he actually believes it or not. whether it's like higher and lower, and he's sort of saying something that he doesn't really believe with the intent of cashing it all back out in an evolutionary story later on. There's a great run of articles back and forth between Jim Lennox and Michael Giesman on exactly this. Darwin was not a teleologist. Darwin was a teleologist. And then like Darwin was not a teleologist, but his language is a different question. Or something. It's this like great back and forth angry series of articles. Which is all a long-winded way of saying it's not at all obvious in the Darwinian context what kind of evidence homology is supposed to be. For that matter, it's one of the open central problems in Phil Bio this very day, right? Trying to figure out what do we actually know once we know that, you know, my forearm and the relevant parts of the bat wing have common descent and are thus in some sense developmentally the same part.
And it's the same for mental state, emotion.
And yeah, and it seems like, well, if you're buying Darwin's setup, Darwin wants it to be exactly the same, I think, for mental states, right? You're activating the same facial expressions, you're engaged in the same kind of emoting, and so by extension, it's the same biological process. But again,
but it's not clear what it means the same.
as easy as it is, I mean, for that matter, as difficult as it is to say what we mean by the same for a forearm, it's all the more difficult to figure out what we mean by the same if the same is, you know, my experience of being mad and my cat's experience of being mad. Mental state of being mad. These are really going to be very hard to pin down. And we're going to lose grip on Darwin here precisely because it's not clear. I mean, when Darwin talks about the emotions, as you know, you've just been in this text, it all sounds pretty behaviorist anyway, right? The mental states are kind of an afterthought. They're getting carried along behind this evolutionary story about, look, all the muscle groups are homologous.
Yeah. We could almost say that Darwin is a person that do not think we infer the mental state. The feature is part of the mental state, so we see the mental state.
Yeah. That I think that would be consistent with a lot of the way he writes about this stuff, despite the fact that that's a really weird claim to make from a contemporary philosophical perspective.
Yeah, because we have this idea that mental state are these bizarre things, almost dualistic.
Gotta be very different.
But for Darwin,
we behave, they behave. Sometimes we behave the same.
The mental state,
Yeah.
the behavior, the chemistry, the hormones, it's all the same.
It's all homologs.
Yeah.
It's homologs all the way down.
Okay. Thank you.
But even if two things have developed the same function but do have the common ancestry, finally it is not so much a problem for Darwin, I can imagine, because on the one hand, of course, he wants to defend this idea of common ancestry, but on the other hand, he has this mechanism of natural selection, and just because of this, if you forget the ancestry, you can say at least this function has developed in different ways, but because of the natural selection, and in this sense, his theory is not endangered by the fact that you can have two things which come from different origins as long as they have some function.
No, that's exactly right. It's not as though if he's happy to accept examples of convergent evolution, and he thinks there are many of them, and he doesn't see them as a threat at all. In fact, he sees them as an interesting, different kind of evidence, right? You know, for example, the sort of vague torpedo shape of things in water, right? That's just going to happen. That's physics. It's how you want to move through the water. Manatees notwithstanding.
Flight has been developing many branches of
right. Right. And he talks about, you know, oh yeah, you go from, you know, you got flying squirrels and you got bats. You know, that's what more do you need? You can pretty much fill in the details in your head at that point. But he does think, I think, that homology is even stronger evidence. Right, and so that's why I think he's at pains in the context of the emotions to really, when he can, demonstrate genuine homologies, because he thinks it's even better. appealing to convergent evolution.
Just a short point to go into your direction. I think some contemporary studies show that if you take medicine which reduce your facial expression, then by self-reporting, if we study a lot of these people on a wide scale, you will observe that they feel less emotion. So in some way there are some correlation. I mean, maybe we cannot make strict equalities, but it can be a good direction to investigate.
That's really cool.
So if your face is paralyzed, you feel effectively less, at least self-reporting.
Yeah.
Wow.
So you mean that people declare that
Yes, but we have to check if it's only self-reporting or also some kind of non-self-reporting. I don't remember exactly, but I mean it's already something scientifically proven, which is interesting.
When you can self-control it too, if it's medical, if it's not like a
maybe it can be
congenital thing. Yeah, so you can report before you take the drug, and then you can take the drug and report. That's really cool. That's really cool. I didn't know that.
No further questions? All right. Okay, so thank you.